Have you ever heard of slavery that hid behind prayer? Of chains disguised as pilgrimage robes? Of human beings trafficked not in the shadows, but in the most sacred city on earth? We talk about the Atlantic slave trade. We learn about the plantations of America, the sugar fields of Brazil, the cotton empires of the South. But there was another trade, older, longer, hidden behind the walls of cities where Western eyes could not enter. The Red Sea. Every year, thousands of African souls were shipped from the coasts of Somalia, Ethiopia, and Sudan to the ports of Arabia. They crossed on wooden dhows, packed into holds designed for cargo. The prettiest girls were oiled and dressed in pink silk. The strongest boys were castrated before the crossing, and all of them, every single one, were sold in the shadow of the holiest shrine in Islam. This is the story of Khadija bint Musa, born free in the highlands of Ethiopia, captured at 14, sold 3 times before reaching Jeddah, forced to pose as a pilgrim servant to enter the forbidden city of Mecca. But Khadija could read. Khadija could write. And Khadija had a memory that held everything she witnessed, like a photograph holds light. What she saw in Mecca would eventually reach the British Parliament. What she documented would fuel the abolitionist movement for decades. What she sacrificed would cost her everything. If you believe that every voice stolen by history deserves to be heard, subscribe to this channel. Turn on notifications. Because stories like this don't tell themselves. This is the slave trade they never taught you about. The ruins of Zila still stand on the coast of what is now Djibouti. Crumbling walls, empty doorways. The skeleton of a port that once processed more human cargo than any harbor in East Africa. In the 1850s, Zila was a machine built for one purpose, the export of African flesh to Arabia. Every year, between 2,000 and 4,000 souls pass through this single port alone. They came from the interior, from the Gala highlands of Ethiopia, from the villages surrounding Lake Chad, from the Sudanese borderlands where raiders struck without warning. They arrived in coffles, chained neck to neck, driven by jalabs, the slave traders who spoke of their merchandise the way farmers speak of livestock. The journey to Zila could take months, across burning deserts where water was measured in mouthfuls, through mountain passes where the weak fell and were left where they dropped. The raiders preferred children, easier to control, easier to transport, easier to break. They took women for the harems of wealthy Arabs. They took young boys for a fate worse than labor, castration performed before the crossing because Islamic law prohibited the operation on Muslim soil. The survival rate on the march to the coast was perhaps 60%. 4 out of 10 never reached the sea. Those who survived were prepared for market. Their skin was cleaned and burnished with coconut oil until it gleamed in the sun. Their faces were painted with red and white stripes, tribal markings that meant nothing, applied simply because buyers found them exotic. Those who had been starved on the journey were fed to restore their flesh, fattened like animals before slaughter. Then the dhows came. These wooden sailing vessels had plied the Red Sea for centuries, carrying spices and gold and silk between Africa and Arabia. Now they carried human beings. The captives were packed into holds never designed for passengers, stacked like cordwood in the suffocating darkness below deck. In the summer months, the temperature in those holds could kill. When British patrol ships appeared on the horizon, the traders had a simple solution. Throw the cargo overboard, chains and all. Better to lose the merchandise than face the penalties. As many as 6,000 Africans per year made this crossing from the Somali coast alone. From Berbera, from Tajura, from Zayla, the dhows sailed to Mocha, to Jeddah, to Suez, to Muscat, a river of human suffering flowing north across the sea. At the mouth of that river, waiting to be processed, stood a girl named Khadija. She was 14 years old. She had been free for the first 12 years of her life, the daughter of a village teacher in the Ethiopian highlands who had taught her to read Arabic script and memorize Quranic verses. She had been captured 2 years earlier, when raiders struck her village at dawn. She had watched her father killed defending their home. She had been separated from her mother at the coast. She had already been sold twice, once in the interior, once at Zila. Now she stood on the deck of a dhow called the Fatima, watching the African coast disappear behind her, knowing that whatever waited on the other shore would be the rest of her life. But Khadija had something the traders did not know about. She could read their documents, she could understand their conversations, and she had a memory that forgot nothing. In the hold of that ship, as the African coast vanished and the Arabian shore drew near, Khadija began to compose the first of many mental records, names, numbers, routes, prices, everything she witnessed, everything she would one day make the world see. If you want to follow more cases like this, that shake the foundations of society and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any investigation. Jeddah rose from the sea like a mirage of white coral and wooden lattice, the gateway to Mecca, the largest slave port in Arabia. The Fatima entered the harbor in late July 1853, joining dozens of other vessels that had made the crossing from Africa. The dhows clustered at the docks like flies on carrion, unloading their human cargo into the hands of waiting merchants. Khadija was pulled from the hold with 37 other captives, women and children mostly, though a few young men who had survived the castration procedure stumbled among them. They were herded onto the dock, blinking in the harsh Arabian sun, their legs unsteady after weeks at sea. The jalabs were waiting. These were the middlemen of the trade, the merchants who purchased slaves wholesale from the ship captains and sold them retail in the markets of the Hejaz. They moved among the new arrivals with practiced eyes, assessing value the way a butcher assesses meat. They checked teeth. They examined limbs for signs of disease or injury. They lifted garments to inspect bodies with a casualness that stripped the captives of their last shred of dignity. Khadija was purchased by a trader named Hassan al-Rashid, a heavy-set man from a family that had been in the business for 3 generations. He paid 40 Maria Theresa dollars for her, a moderate price for a girl of her age and appearance. He would sell her in Mecca for twice that amount, perhaps more if he could pass her off as trained in household service. But first, she had to reach Mecca. And here, Khadija witnessed the most cynical aspect of the entire trade, the use of the Hajj as cover for human trafficking. Every year, the pilgrimage to Mecca drew hundreds of thousands of Muslims from across the world. They came from Morocco and India, from Persia and Indonesia, from the farthest reaches of the Islamic realm. They came to fulfill the sacred obligation required of every Muslim who could afford the journey. And among them came the slaves. The traders had perfected a system of breathtaking cruelty. They brought their merchandise into the holy cities disguised as servants, as wives, as pilgrims themselves. African Muslims who had been promised sponsorship for the Hajj arrived in Arabia to discover that their sponsors were actually slave traders. Those without proper papers were arrested, imprisoned, and handed over to licensed dealers. Women were married to their traffickers for the journey, then divorced and sold upon arrival. The sacred pilgrimage had become a pipeline for human cargo. Hassan al-Rashid gathered his new acquisitions and prepared them for the journey to Mecca. He dressed them in pilgrim garments, the white ihram that all pilgrims wore, symbolizing equality before God. He coached them in the basic responses they would need if questioned. Yes, I am traveling with my master. Yes, I am his servant. Yes, I am here to perform the Hajj. He did not know that one of his new slaves understood every word he said. Khadija listened as Hassan discussed prices with his partners. She memorized the names of the buyers who had placed orders for specific types of merchandise. She noted the shipping schedules, the routes, the bribes paid to officials who looked the other way. She recorded everything in her mind, building a case that would one day reach across oceans. The caravan to Mecca departed on August 15th. Khadija walked with the other slaves, dressed in the white robes of pilgrimage, invisible among the faithful. She was entering the forbidden city not as a worshiper, but as merchandise. And she was watching. The road from Jeddah to Mecca was 40 miles of heat and dust and danger. The caravan moved slowly, a river of pilgrims flowing toward the sacred city. Wealthy merchants rode camels draped in fine cloth. Poor pilgrims walked barefoot, their lips cracked from thirst. Ottoman soldiers patrolled the flanks, nominally protecting the travelers from Bedouin raiders who haunted these mountains, and among them moved the merchandise. Khadija walked with a group of women from Hassan's inventory. They were roped together at the wrists, loosely, so they could maintain the fiction of being servants rather than slaves. An older Sudanese woman named Fatima walked beside her, a former teacher's wife who had been captured in a raid on her village. A young Gala girl named Amina, no more than 10 years old, clung to Fatima's free hand. They did not speak. Speaking attracted attention. Attention attracted punishment. But Khadija watched. She watched the soldiers accept bribes to look the other way when the coffles passed. She watched the traders consult their ledgers, calculating profits from the season's harvest. She watched the buyers who had traveled from Egypt and Constantinople specifically for the Hajj markets, where the selection was always best. She watched, and she remembered. The caravan was attacked twice by Bedouin raiders. Both times the soldiers drove them off after brief skirmishes. Both times the merchandise was kept at the center of the column, protected by rings of armed men. The traders could afford to lose pilgrims. They could not afford to lose inventory. After the second attack, Khadija overheard Hassan speaking with another trader about security arrangements. "The British patrols are getting bolder," the other man said. "They intercepted 3 ships last month. We lost over 100 head." "The British cannot touch us here," Hassan replied. "Their ships patrol the sea, but the holy cities are closed to them. What happens in Mecca stays in Mecca." He laughed. The other trader laughed with him. Khadija did not laugh. She memorized the conversation. She added it to the growing archive in her mind. On the third day, the caravan reached the outskirts of Mecca. Khadija had been raised Muslim. She knew the prayers. She knew the rituals. She knew the stories of the Prophet, the significance of the Kaaba, the meaning of the pilgrimage that every Muslim was obligated to perform. And now she was entering the holiest city on earth as property. The irony did not escape her. The religion that taught the equality of all believers before God, that very religion had been twisted into a cover for the commerce in human flesh. The pilgrimage that symbolized the unity of the faithful had become a vehicle for trafficking the most vulnerable among them. She looked at the minarets rising against the sky. She looked at the crowds of pilgrims streaming toward the great mosque. She looked at the face of little Amina, the 10-year-old Gala girl who did not yet understand what awaited her in the markets ahead, and she made a silent vow. If she survived this place, she would make the world know what happened here. She would find a way to speak, even if speaking cost her life. The sacred city opened before her. The slave markets waited within. Leave a comment saying, "Never give up on the truth," if you believe that justice must reach all the oppressed. The slave market of Mecca operated near the Masa, the covered gallery where pilgrims performed the ritual running between the hills of Safa and Marwa. It was the largest market in Arabia, larger than Jeddah, larger than Medina, drawing buyers from across the Ottoman Empire and beyond. Khadija was brought to the market on her second day in the city. The routine was familiar by now. The slaves were washed and oiled, dressed in light muslins that displayed their bodies for inspection. They were arranged on raised platforms according to value, the prettiest girls on the highest benches, the plain women below them, the boys lowest of all. The market occupied a large street roofed with matting to provide shade from the brutal sun. Coffee houses lined the edges, where buyers could refresh themselves between transactions. The atmosphere was almost festive, merchants calling out prices, buyers haggling over merchandise, money changing hands with the ease of any commercial exchange. Khadija sat on a middle bench, neither the most valuable nor the least. She kept her eyes down, her posture submissive, her face empty of expression. She had learned that survival meant invisibility. Slaves who attracted attention, whether through beauty or defiance, received attention they did not want. But her ears were open. She listened to the prices being quoted. A healthy young male for field work, 50 to 100 Maria Theresa dollars. a beautiful girl trained in domestic service, 200 or more. A eunuch, castrated, docile, trustworthy with the women of the household, 7 times the price of an intact male. She listened to the origins being discussed. Gala from the Ethiopian highlands, Sudanese from the Nile, Somali from the coast, Nubians prized for their features, Zanj from the East African interior. Each origin carried its own reputation, its own market value. She listened to the destinations being planned. Egypt for the largest buyers, Persia for those who wanted exotic features, Constantinople for the Ottoman elite, the Gulf states for pearl diving and labor, the holy cities themselves for household service. She listened, and she built her archive. On that first day in the market, she witnessed the sale of Amina, the 10-year-old Gala girl. A merchant from Cairo purchased her for $120, more than he would have paid for an adult male laborer. The merchant examined her teeth, her limbs, her eyes. He asked if she had been spoiled, the trader's term for sexual violation. Hassan assured him she had not. The merchant nodded, satisfied. Amina did not understand what was happening. She looked at Fatima, the older woman who had protected her on the journey. She reached for her hand. The merchant pulled her away. Khadija watched Amina disappear into the crowd, led by a rope around her wrist, heading toward the harbor and the ship that would carry her to Egypt. She was 10 years old. That night, in the holding pen where Hassan kept his unsold inventory, Khadija spoke for the first time in weeks. "I can write," she whispered to Fatima. "I can write in Arabic. If I can get paper, I can record what we have seen." Fatima looked at her with eyes that had seen too much. "And then what? Who will read it? Who will care?" "Someone will care," Khadija said. "Someone has to care." She did not know yet how right she was. Khadija was sold on the 5th day. Her buyer was a man named Ahmad ibn Khalil, a merchant from Jeddah who dealt in household goods and occasionally household servants. He paid Hassan $85 for her, a fair price for a girl of 14 with no special training or exceptional beauty. But Ahmad had noticed something the other buyers had missed. When the slaves were being processed for the market, a scribe had come through to record names and origins. Khadija, forgetting herself for a moment, had corrected his Arabic spelling. It was a small thing, a letter misplaced, a vowel mark wrong, but Ahmad had seen it. A literate slave was valuable. A literate slave could keep accounts, write letters, manage correspondence. Ahmad's own Arabic was functional but imperfect. A girl who could read and write would be useful. He purchased her without haggling. What Ahmad did not know, what he would not discover until much later, was that his household included a British contact. The British Empire had been trying to suppress the Red Sea slave trade for decades. They had treaties with the Ottoman authorities, agreements with local rulers, patrol ships cruising the waters from Suez to Aden. But their efforts were hampered by one insurmountable obstacle: the holy cities. Mecca and Medina were closed to non-Muslims. No British agent could enter. No European witness could document what happened within those walls. The treaties meant nothing if they could not be enforced, and enforcement required evidence that could not be gathered. So the British developed a network of informants within the cities themselves. Local merchants sympathetic to abolition, freed slaves who had settled in Arabia, Muslim converts who were willing to risk their lives for the cause. Ahmad ibn Khalil was not part of this network, but his business partner was. Yusuf al-Omani was a merchant from Muscat who had spent years trading between Arabia and the British ports of India. He had seen the abolitionist movement growing in Bombay and Calcutta. He had read the pamphlets, heard the arguments, come to believe that the trade in human flesh was a sin against God and man. He could not act openly. That would mean death in the Hejaz. But he could pass information. He could document what he witnessed. He could serve as a link between the markets of Mecca and the activists in London who were fighting to end the trade. When Yusuf learned that Ahmad had purchased a literate slave girl, he saw an opportunity. He visited Ahmad's household on the pretext of business. He observed Khadija at her work. He noticed the intelligence in her eyes, the precision of her writing, the way she watched everything around her with the attention of someone compiling evidence. He took a risk. "Girl," he said, when they were alone for a moment, "if you could tell the world what you have seen, would you?" Khadija looked at him. She did not know if this was a test, a trap, a moment of salvation. She had learned that trust was dangerous. She had learned that hope was often punished, but she answered anyway. "I would," she said. "I would tell them everything." Yusuf nodded slowly. "Then we have work to do." For the next 3 months, Khadija became the most dangerous person in Mecca. By day, she worked as a household slave in Ahmad's home, cleaning, cooking, managing correspondence as her literacy became known and valued. By night, she wrote. Yusuf provided paper, ink, a hiding place for the documents she produced. The risk was enormous. If discovered, Khadija would be tortured and killed as a spy. Yusuf would be executed as a traitor. Ahmad, even if innocent, would be destroyed by association. They proceeded anyway. Khadija documented everything she had witnessed since her capture 2 years earlier. The raid on her village, the march to the coast, the processing at Zila, the crossing on the Fatima, the preparation for market in Jeddah, the caravan to Mecca, the sale of Amina, the operation of the markets themselves. She wrote in precise, detailed Arabic that could be translated for European audiences. She provided names, the names of traders, ship captains, buyers, officials who accepted bribes. She provided numbers, prices, quantities, routes, schedules. She provided descriptions of the methods used to traffic human beings under cover of the sacred pilgrimage. She described the Hajj route scheme in detail, how Africans were promised sponsorship for the pilgrimage, brought to Arabia without proper documentation, arrested as illegal entrants, and handed over to licensed slave dealers. She estimated that hundreds of victims per year were trafficked through this single method alone. She described the markets themselves, the arrangement of merchandise on benches according to value, the inspection procedures, the prices for different categories of slaves. She quoted conversations she had overheard, including Hassan's boast that what happens in Mecca stays in Mecca because the British could not enter the holy cities. She described the treatment of the enslaved, the separations of families, the castration of young boys, the sexual exploitation that was common even when traders claimed their merchandise was unspoiled. Page after page, night after night. A comprehensive indictment of the entire system, written by someone who had survived it from the inside. Yusuf read the documents as they accumulated. He wept. "This will change things," he said. "This will force them to act." "Will it?" Khadija asked. She had learned not to hope. "It must," Yusuf replied. "The British Parliament will see this. The abolitionists will use it. The pressure will become impossible to ignore." He began to plan how to smuggle the documents out of Arabia, but they were not alone in their awareness. Someone else had noticed the literate slave girl who watched too carefully and remembered too much. His name was Ibrahim, and he was a freed slave who had turned informant for the traders. It was not an uncommon path. Some who escaped bondage found that their knowledge of the trade made them valuable to those who ran it. They could identify troublemakers among the merchandise. They could spot potential runaways. They could recognize the signs of resistance before it became dangerous. Ibrahim had been watching Khadija since she arrived in Ahmad's household. He noticed her literacy, unusual for a slave, suspicious for a recent captive. He noticed her conversations with Yusuf, brief but intense. He noticed the way she looked at the world, not with the broken acceptance of the truly defeated, but with the focused attention of someone gathering information. He reported his suspicions to Hassan al-Rashid, the trader who had originally sold her. Hassan was troubled by the report. If the girl was indeed compiling information about the trade, the consequences could be severe. The British had been pressuring the Ottoman authorities for years. A detailed account from inside Mecca, especially one that documented the use of the Hajj as cover for trafficking, could be devastating. He decided to investigate personally. The opportunity came during a dinner at Ahmad's house, where Hassan had been invited as a business associate. He observed Khadija serving the meal, noting her poise, her intelligence, the way she moved through the room with awareness that exceeded her station. After the meal, he asked Ahmad about her. "A lucky purchase," Ahmad said. "She can read and write better than most scholars. I use her for correspondence." "Where did she learn?" "Her father was a teacher in Ethiopia. She was educated before her capture." Hassan nodded thoughtfully. "You should be careful with such a slave. Literacy can be dangerous. It gives ideas." Ahmad dismissed the concern. "She is obedient, industrious. I have no complaints." But Hassan was not satisfied. That night, he sent Ibrahim to search the household while everyone slept. Ibrahim found the documents hidden in a storage room, pages and pages of testimony in Khadija's precise handwriting. Names, numbers, roots, accusations. He brought them to Hassan. Hassan read them through the night. By dawn, his face was gray with fury and fear. "This could destroy us all," he said. "Every family in the trade, every official who has taken bribes, every ship captain who has carried cargo from Africa." "What do you want done?" Ibrahim asked. Hassan considered. Killing the girl would be easy, but it might not be enough. If Yusuf had already communicated with his British contacts, if copies of the documents had already been sent, then eliminating Khadija would only create a martyr. He needed to know how far the damage had spread. "Bring her to me," he said, "and bring Yusuf al-Omani. We will have a conversation." The net was closing, and Khadija did not yet know she was trapped. They came for her at dawn. 4 men entered Ahmad's household while the family still slept. They seized Khadija from her sleeping mat, bound her hands, covered her mouth before she could scream. They dragged her through the streets to Hassan's compound, threw her into a room with stone walls and no windows. Yusuf was already there. His face was swollen, his robe stained with blood. They had beaten him through the night. Hassan al-Rashid sat in a chair, the confiscated documents spread before him. "You have been busy," he said to Khadija. "Very busy indeed." She did not answer. There was no answer that would help. "Do you understand what you have done? You have threatened the livelihoods of every trader in the Hejaz. You have endangered the fortunes of some of the most powerful families in Arabia. You have attempted to bring the infidel British into matters that do not concern them." Still she did not answer. Hassan leaned forward. "I want to know who else has seen these documents. I want to know if copies have been sent. I want to know the names of everyone in your network." Khadija met his eyes. "I have no network. I wrote alone." "You lie." Hassan gestured to Yusuf. "This one has already told us of his British contacts. He has given us names in Aden, in Bombay. What he has not told us is how much information has already left Arabia." Khadija looked at Yusuf. His eyes were closed. His breathing was shallow. Whatever they had done to him, he had broken. Or had he? She remembered something he had told her weeks earlier. "If we are discovered, I will give them false names, false contacts. I will send them chasing shadows while the real documents travel by another route." Had Yusuf sacrificed himself to misdirect the traitors? Had he bought time for the evidence to reach safety? She did not know. She could not know. But she knew that she had to hold on. Every hour she resisted was an hour for the documents to travel further, to reach hands that could use them. "I wrote alone," she repeated. "There is no network. There are no copies." Hassan nodded to his men. The interrogation lasted 3 days. They used methods that Khadija would never describe, not even in the testimony she would eventually give to the British authorities. They demanded names she did not have. They asked about contacts who did not exist. They accused her of conspiracies that went far beyond anything she had actually done. Through it all, she gave them nothing. Not because she was brave, though she was. Not because she was strong, though she was. She gave them nothing because she understood something fundamental about the nature of resistance. The truth was already loose in the world. Whatever happened to her now, the documents existed. Copies had been made. Yusuf had told her that his contacts in Aden had received enough information to act. The machine she had set in motion could not be stopped by breaking one small girl. On the third day, Hassan made his decision. "She knows nothing more," he said. "Or if she does, she will not tell us. Either way, she is useless." He sentenced her to death. The execution would be carried out at dawn, by beheading, as was traditional for slaves who betrayed their masters. Yusuf would die beside her. Their bodies would be left in the desert as a warning to others. They had one more night to live. And in that night, something unexpected happened. His name was Captain James Wellstead, and he commanded HMS Scout, a British patrol vessel assigned to anti-slavery operations in the Red Sea. For months, Wellstead had been receiving intelligence from contacts in Arabia about the slave trade operating through the holy cities. The information was fragmentary, incomplete, gathered at enormous risk by informants who could never be acknowledged publicly. But it painted a picture of a trafficking network that dwarfed anything the British had previously understood. Then, 2 weeks earlier, a packet of documents had reached the British consulate in Aden. Dozens of pages in Arabic describing the slave markets of Mecca in unprecedented detail. Names, numbers, routes, methods. A comprehensive indictment written by someone who had witnessed the trade from the inside. The documents were explosive. If made public, they would force the British government to increase pressure on the Ottoman authorities. They would energize the abolitionist movement. They would demonstrate, beyond any doubt, that the treaties designed to suppress the Red Sea slave trade were being openly violated in the holiest cities of Islam. But the documents also contained a problem. They implicated specific individuals, traders, officials, ship captains. If those individuals learned that their names were on British intelligence lists, they would flee, destroy evidence, eliminate witnesses, including the witness who had written the documents in the first place. Wellstead received orders to extract the source if possible. It was an impossible mission. British agents could not enter Mecca. British ships could not approach the coast without being observed. Any rescue attempt would have to be carried out through intermediaries, through networks of local contacts who might or might not be trustworthy. But Wellstead had one advantage. The same network that had smuggled out the documents could smuggle in a message. He sent word to his contact in Jeddah, a merchant named Al-Omani who had been funneling information for years. The message reached Jeddah 2 days before Khadijah's scheduled execution. What happened next required the cooperation of a dozen people, any one of whom could have betrayed the operation. The merchant who bribed the guards at Hassan's compound, the servant who unlocked the cell door, the camel driver who waited at the edge of the city with 2 animals and supplies for a 3-day journey, the boat captain who agreed to carry fugitives to a British ship waiting offshore. At midnight, the cell door opened. Khadijah looked up to see a figure in the darkness, not one of Hassan's men, but a stranger whose face was covered. "Can you walk?" the stranger whispered in Arabic. She could, barely. 3 days of interrogation had left her weak, but she could walk. Yusuf could not. They had broken his legs. "Leave me," he whispered. "Save yourself." The stranger looked at Khadijah. The decision was hers. She thought of everything Yusuf had risked for her. The documents, the network, the misdirection that had bought time for the evidence to escape. She thought of the man who had asked her if she wanted to tell the world what she had seen. "We carry him," she said. "We carry him, or we all stay." They carried him. Through the streets of the sleeping city, past the guards who had been bribed to look the other way, to the edge of the desert where the camels waited, through the night toward the coast, following routes that the smugglers knew and the authorities did not. 3 days later, they reached the sea. HMS Scout was waiting offshore, her lights extinguished, her crew watching the beach for the signal fire that would tell them the fugitives had arrived. Khadija watched the flames leap into the darkness. She watched the boat push off from the British ship and row toward the shore. She watched the sailors splash through the surf to help them aboard. And when the boat pulled away from Arabia, carrying her toward freedom, she permitted herself to weep. Not from joy, though there was joy. Not from relief, though there was relief. She wept because she was carrying with her the names and faces of everyone she had left behind. Amina, the 10-year-old sold to the Egyptian merchant. Fatima, the Sudanese woman who had protected her on the journey. Thousands upon thousands of others, still trapped in the machinery of the trade. She had escaped. They had not. The work was not finished. Khadija arrived in London in March 1854, escorted by Captain Wellstead and carrying a packet of documents that would reshape the British understanding of the Arabian slave trade. She testified before the House of Commons Select Committee on the Slave Trade on April 17, 1854. She spoke for 5 hours, answering questions through an Arabic interpreter, describing everything she had witnessed from her capture in Ethiopia to her escape from Mecca. She described the raid on her village, the Kafil march to the coast, the slave ship crossing, the markets of Jeddah and Mecca, the sale of Amina, the documents she had compiled at the risk of her life. She named names: Hassan al-Rashid, the Jalab known as Ibrahim, the ship captain of the Fatima, the officials who had accepted bribes, the merchants who had purchased human beings in the shadow of the Kaaba. The members of parliament listened in silence. Several wept openly. When she finished, the chairman of the committee asked her if she had anything else to add. "Only this," she said. "Every year, thousands of souls are taken from Africa and sold in the holy cities of Arabia. The treaties that your government has signed with the Ottoman authorities are worthless. The patrols that your ships conduct in the Red Sea catch only a fraction of the trade. What happens in Mecca is hidden from Western eyes, and the traders know this. They believe they are safe. They believe no one will ever hold them accountable." She paused. "I am here to tell them they are wrong." Her testimony was published in the parliamentary papers of 1854. It was reprinted in newspapers across Britain and America. It was translated into French, German, Spanish. It became a foundational document of the abolitionist movement, cited in debates and sermons and pamphlets for decades to come. The British government increased its pressure on the Ottoman authorities. Naval patrols were strengthened. Diplomatic missions were dispatched to the Sharif of Mecca, demanding action against the traders. The trade did not end. It continued in diminished form for another century. Slavery was not officially abolished in Saudi Arabia until 1962. The patterns Khadija documented persisted long after her death, but her testimony had consequences. Ships were intercepted, slaves were freed, traders were forced to modify their methods, to operate more carefully, to accept lower profits. The impunity that Hassan al-Rashid had boasted about, "What happens in Mecca stays in Mecca," was shattered. A slave girl from the Ethiopian highlands had spoken, and the world had listened. Khadija lived the rest of her life in England, first in London, and later in a small cottage in Devon provided by supporters of the abolitionist movement. She never returned to Africa. She never learned what had happened to her mother, her sister, the other members of her village who had survived the raid. The letters she sent to missionary stations in Ethiopia received no response. Her family had vanished into the vast machinery of the trade, lost among the millions. She married in 1859, a British dock worker named Thomas Palmer, who had heard her speak at an abolitionist meeting and been moved by her story. They had 3 children together, all of whom were raised to understand where they came from and what their mother had survived. She continued to work for the cause. She spoke at meetings across Britain. She provided testimony to additional parliamentary committees. She advised the Anti-Slavery Society on the conditions in the Red Sea region. She trained other escaped slaves in how to document their experiences and present them effectively to Western audiences. But the trauma never fully healed. She suffered nightmares throughout her life, dreams of the coffle march, the slave ship, the markets of Mecca. She flinched at sudden noises. She could not bear to be in enclosed spaces for long periods of time. The scars from her interrogation were visible on her back and arms until the day she died, and she carried guilt. Guilt for those she had left behind. For Amina, sold to the Egyptian merchant at 10 years old. For Fatima, last seen in Hassan's compound when Khadija was dragged away. For Yusuf, who had survived the escape but never walked again, his broken legs a permanent reminder of the price of resistance. For the thousands upon thousands who remained in bondage while she gave speeches in comfortable drawing rooms to sympathetic audiences who could never truly understand. She wrote a memoir in 1867, published by a small London press. It sold modestly but received favorable reviews in abolitionist publications. The book documented her experiences in unflinching detail, holding nothing back, refusing to soften the horror of what she had witnessed. In the final chapter, she wrote, "I am asked often if I am grateful for my freedom. Of course I am. Every breath I take in liberty is a gift. But gratitude is not enough. Gratitude does not free those still in chains. Gratitude does not hold accountable those who profit from human suffering. Gratitude does not change the systems that make such suffering possible. I did not survive to be grateful. I survived to fight. And I will fight until my last breath, or until the last slave walks free from the last market, whichever comes first." She died in 1891 at the age of 52, of pneumonia contracted during a speaking tour in the cold English winter. Her grave in Devon bears a simple inscription: Khadija Palmer, née bint Musa, 1839-1891. She told the truth. The truth she told still echoes. Khadija's testimony, combined with the documents she had compiled in Mecca, revealed for the first time the full scope of the Arabian slave trade network. It stretched from the villages of Central Africa to the markets of Constantinople. It employed thousands of people: raiders, traders, ship captains, brokers, officials. It generated profits in the millions of dollars annually. And it operated with near-perfect impunity because its most important operations took place in cities closed to Western observers. The network had multiple entry points. In the west, the trans-Saharan routes brought captives from the Lake Chad region through the desert to the markets of North Africa. In the south, the Red Sea routes carried merchandise from the Somali coast, from Ethiopia, from Sudan, to the ports of Arabia. In the east, dhows from Zanzibar and Madagascar supplied the markets of the Persian Gulf. The holy cities of Mecca and Medina were the nexus, the place where all these routes converged during the annual pilgrimage. Traders brought their best merchandise to the Hajj markets, knowing that buyers from across the Muslim world would be present, flush with money, eager to purchase servants, concubines, laborers for their distant households. Khadija's documents identified specific individuals at every level of the network: the jalabs who purchased captives wholesale at the African coast, the ship captains who transported them across the Red Sea, the brokers who managed the markets in Jeddah and Mecca, the officials who accepted bribes to ignore the traffic, the wealthy buyers who created the demand that fueled the entire system. She provided estimates of scale that shocked the British authorities. As many as 6,000 Africans per year from the Somali coast alone, thousands more from Madagascar, from Zanzibar, from Sudan, a traffic in human beings that dwarfed the Atlantic slave trade at its height. And she exposed the Hajj route, the cynical use of the sacred pilgrimage as cover for trafficking. Africans promised sponsorship for the journey, brought to Arabia without documentation, arrested and sold. Women married to their traffickers, then divorced and auctioned upon arrival. Children taken from their families under false pretenses, never to be seen again. The British government used Khadija's information to pressure the Ottoman authorities. Treaties were renegotiated. Naval patrols were expanded. Diplomatic pressure was increased. But the network adapted. The traders developed new methods: smaller ships, different routes, better concealment. The Hajj traffic continued, though more carefully disguised. The markets still operated, though less openly than before. Progress was made. Thousands of slaves were intercepted and freed. The profits of the trade declined. The impunity that Hassan had boasted about eroded, slowly but steadily. But the network never fully died. As late as the 1950s, slaves were still being traded in Saudi Arabia. The Red Sea routes remained active until well into the 20th century. The last legal slave market in the region did not close until 1962. Khadija had struck a blow against the system. She had not destroyed it. The fight continued long after her death. What happened to the others? The names that appear in Khadija's documents, the faces she described in her testimony, the souls who shared her captivity but did not share her escape. Most are lost to history. The records of the slave markets were not preserved for posterity. The traders did not keep archives that survived to modern times. The victims themselves, scattered across the Ottoman Empire and beyond, left few traces that historians can follow. But some fates can be reconstructed. Amina, the 10-year-old Gala girl sold to the Egyptian merchant, appears in a British consular report from Cairo in 1861. A young woman matching her description was working as a domestic servant in the household of a wealthy pasha. She had been converted to Islam, given a new name, integrated into Egyptian society so thoroughly that she no longer remembered her original language. Whether she recalled anything of her capture, her transport, her sale in Mecca, cannot be determined. Fatima, the Sudanese woman who had protected Khadija on the journey, was probably killed during the crackdown that followed Khadija's escape. Hassan al-Rashid, furious at the betrayal, conducted a purge of his household, executing several slaves suspected of involvement in the conspiracy. A woman matching Fatima's description was among those killed. Yusuf al-Omani, the merchant who had facilitated Khadija's documentation and escape, survived. His broken legs never healed properly, and he walked with crutches for the rest of his life. He relocated to Aden, where British protection kept him safe from retaliation. He continued to provide intelligence on the slave trade until his death in 1873, helping to identify ships, routes, and traders for interception by British patrols. His contributions were never publicly acknowledged. To do so would have endangered other informants still operating in Arabia. Hassan al-Rashid faced no consequences for his role in the trade. Despite being named in Khadija's testimony, despite being identified as one of the major traffickers operating out of Mecca, he remained beyond the reach of British justice. The Ottoman authorities refused to arrest him. The Sharif of Mecca declined to act against a respected merchant from an established family. Hassan continued his business for another 20 years, eventually dying of natural causes in 1876, wealthy and unpunished. This was perhaps the hardest truth that Khadija had to accept. That testimony alone could not bring justice. That evidence alone could not destroy the system. The network she had exposed continued to operate. The men she had named continued to profit. The structures of power that protected them remained intact. But her testimony mattered, because it created a record, because it proved what was possible when the powerless found a voice, because it showed that the forbidden cities were not truly impenetrable, that the impunity of the traitors was not absolute, that someone was watching, documenting, remembering. The survivors who came after Khadija, the escaped slaves who testified in the following decades, the informants who passed information to British agents, the activists who continued the fight, drew strength from her example. She had proven that it could be done. That was her legacy. Today, the slave markets of Mecca are gone. The routes that carried human cargo across the Red Sea have closed. The trade that Khadija documented has ended, at least in its historical form. But the legacy remains. In the museums of London and Washington, documents from the abolitionist archives preserve Khadija's testimony. Her words, translated and reproduced, continue to educate new generations about a history that many would prefer to forget. In the academic literature on slavery, Her account is cited as one of the earliest and most detailed descriptions of the Arabian slave trade from the perspective of a survivor. Historians credit her testimony with providing crucial evidence for understanding how the system operated, how it was concealed, how it resisted suppression for so long. In the oral traditions of Ethiopia, traces of her story survive. The village where she was born, destroyed in the raid of 1851, its inhabitants scattered across the slave routes of the Middle East, is remembered in songs and stories. The daughter of the teacher who was taken by the raiders and never came back. The girl who learned to write and used her writing to fight. And in the ongoing struggle against modern forms of slavery, human trafficking, forced labor, debt bondage, her example provides a template. Documentation. Testimony. The power of the survivor's voice to penetrate systems designed for concealment. The methods have changed. The routes have shifted. But the fundamental reality that Khadijah confronted, the reduction of human beings to property, the commerce in human flesh, the structures of power that protect the traffickers, persists in new forms. Her fight continues. In 1853, a 14-year-old girl was sold in the markets of Mecca. She was one of thousands. She should have disappeared into the vast anonymity of the trade, another soul consumed by a system that had operated for centuries. Instead, she watched, she remembered, she wrote. She testified. She told the world what she had seen. And the world, however slowly, however incompletely, began to change. If you watched until the end, it's because you care about these stories that marked our world forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end, so I can know you and understand who really cares about the search for historical truth." Like this video if the story of Khadijah touched your heart. Share it so that the memory of what she sacrificed will never be forgotten.